Straits. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So, today we're looking at war and theories of war. And I just wanted to start by looking at um, chart, this chart of global deaths and conflict over the past 600 years. And this is a kind of an amazing chart because of the amount of data that it portrays. So each circle, each dot is a single conflict. And the size of the circle corresponds to the number of people who were killed in that conflict. So you can see at a glance that World War I and World War II killed far and away more people than any other conflict ever. The only thing that even came close was the 30-Year War in the 17th century. So that's the long view. That gives you a sense of what we're looking at. But now let's narrow things down. This is a chart that compiles data on armed conflicts between 1989 and 2024. And the reason that it focuses on that period is that it's the post-Cold War era. And that's considered a new era in terms of global politics and a global realignment. So as you can see, initially we have an uptick in the number of conflicts that are happening around the world. And almost all of these are civil wars and one-sided violence against civilians. Not a lot of conflicts between states, not a lot of wars between states. And then that peaks in 1994 with the Rwandan genocide. And you can see that more clearly in this slide, which is not the number of conflicts, but the number of deaths. So between 1994 and 2010, you might get the impression that the number of armed conflicts was going down. Now, it's certainly not a straight line, but the general trend or trajectory seems to be declining to a low in 2010, where there were only 86 ongoing conflicts in the world. But then in 2014, that number climbs for the first time above 150, and it's been consistently over 150 for the past decade, with a high of 191 in 2022. In 2024, that number was 184. So this data set divides armed conflicts into distinct categories. But it seems as if almost all contemporary conflicts fall into just three categories. There are one-sided conflicts, non-state conflicts, and intrastate conflicts. So almost all armed conflicts, are one of those three types. So let's define what we mean by these things. One-sided conflicts are about a quarter of all conflicts in the world are what these analysts call one-sided conflict. And that's one-sided violence is the use of armed force by a state or sometimes a non-state armed group against civilians. So examples of this would be Iraq's Anfal campaign against the Kurds, which included mass executions and the use of chemical weapons and the destruction of more than 2,000 villages. The Syrian government killed civilians for decades. Militias in South Sudan have killed thousands of civilians in the past 2 years. All of these would be considered one-sided conflicts. And then there are non-state conflicts. After 2010, almost half of all armed conflicts are ones that don't involve states at all. In 2007, only 25 armed conflicts didn't involve states, but by 2017, 10 years later, that number had almost quadrupled to 93 armed conflicts that did not involve states. So a non-state conflict is a conflict between non-state armed groups, like rebel groups or criminal organizations like drug cartels, or sometimes ethnic groups. So let me give you some examples here. The Central African Republic, where we have various non-state conflicts among different militias. In places like Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger, there are ongoing jihadist insurgencies, sometimes against governments, but also against each other. In Indonesia, there's a fair amount of ethnic and religious conflict. For example, in North Maluku, India has non-state conflicts currently in the state of Manipur, where hundreds of people have been killed in ongoing fighting. And then there are things like drug cartels and gangs that are fighting against each other in places like Mexico, Brazil, Ecuador, and Haiti. And those are also classified, if they are large enough, they're also classified as non-state armed conflict. And then the third large category is intrastate, and that's normally what we would think of as a civil war. So about 30% of all current conflicts are intrastate conflicts between a government and a group of people that's fighting against the government. So what they call a non-state armed group. This is the slide you should be looking at. What they call a non-state armed group. Now, that group could be a rebel group, a criminal organization, or an ethnic group. And the Conflict Trends Report that you read for today identifies, for example, the war in Gaza as a civil war between a state and an armed non-state actor, in this case, Hamas. So this category would also include ethnic and political conflict in Myanmar, in South Sudan, Ethiopia, but it also classifies conflicts like the one between the Mexican government and drug cartels as intrastate conflict, or conflict between a government and a non-government actor on the other hand. And then finally, in 2024, we had 4 conflicts that were classified as interstate, and that means between states. So those are the conflicts that we would traditionally, normally think of as wars between 2 countries. And the 4 conflicts that count as war in 2024 were between Russia and Ukraine, between Iran and Israel, US, UK versus Yemen, and Pakistan and Afghanistan. In 2025, it was also the case that things were heating up between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. We have Israel launching military strikes against Syria and Lebanon, the US bombing nuclear sites in Iran, cross-border clashes between Thailand and Cambodia. In other words, a great deal of military aggression that could easily trigger more interstate war. So, by comparison with almost every other form of conflict, that is, one sided violence, non state conflict, and intrastate conflict or civil wars, interstate conflicts, wars between countries, are relatively infrequent. They're relatively rare compared to the other kinds of conflict that we have. Nevertheless, they are the type of conflict that's most often theorized by political scientists. And there are two reasons for that. So, as Levy points out in our reading for today, wars between states tend to be the most destructive, and they have the biggest impact on the international system. Governments have access to weaponry, they can mobilize armies, they have money, and then they also have intangible resources like nationalism, as we discussed last week, all of which they can deploy in the service of war. And so it's that combination of things, the assets or the resources that they have, that make interstate conflicts the most deadly and destructive. So let's turn our attention now to how political scientists think about war and the theories that they've developed to understand violent conflicts between countries. So, in the reading you did for today, Theories and Causes of War by Jack Levy, the author starts out by explaining that theories of war are organized by level of analysis. And there are three levels of analysis: the individual level, the national level, and the systemic level. So, on page 14, Levy says that levels of analysis classify wars in terms of the level of their primary causal variables. So let me take a minute to explain some of the language that we use in political science when we develop research questions. From our writing assignments in this course, you'll notice that many of the types of questions we ask are why questions. Why did Russia invade Ukraine? Why did Mark Carney win the 2025 election in Canada? Why did the Me Too movement gain traction in 2017? Here's an explanation of the war in Ukraine. I'm not telling you that this is the explanation from the war in Ukraine. I'm saying this is an explanation. This is an explanation that you have heard, that we're familiar with. Russia invaded Ukraine because Vladimir Putin aspires to rebuild the Russian Empire. So there are two variables in this statement. Variables are the factors that make up this argument or explanation. One is a dependent variable and one is an independent variable. So the independent variable is also sometimes called the causal variable. And in this case, the causal variable, the thing that causes the reason, the thing that causes the dependent variable, is because Vladimir Putin aspires to rebuild the Russian Empire. That's our argument or our reason. It's our cause. And the dependent variable is Russia invaded Ukraine. That's the thing we're trying to explain. So, political scientists who theorize causes of war between countries find their answers within this paradigm of the level of analysis. And they've got three levels that they basically work with. The first is the individual level of analysis, and that basically tries to explain why individual human beings make the decisions they do. Intelligence agencies like CSIS or the CIA have departments that basically build psychological profiles of important world figures so that they can analyze what an important person is likely to do, how he is likely to think or act in a particular situation. So, for example, if we think about World War II, some people have argued that Adolf Hitler was the cause of World War II, that it was Hitler's psychological pathologies, that it was his theory of Aryan superiority, maybe it was his childhood that led to World War II. All of these would be arguments that rely on psychological accounts of human temperament or beliefs. Both of these types of arguments, including the one about Putin and the war in Ukraine, this argument, operate at the first individual level of analysis. So any conflict, any theory that attributes a conflict to an individual human being is using an individual level of analysis. The second level of analysis is the national or state level. And this is the reasons that a country goes to war have to do with internal political or economic situation inside the country. So the United States, this is an example, the United States didn't enter World War II until after the bombing of Pearl Harbor because of internal US politics, because the Republican Party took an isolationist position, arguing that this was not our war to fight. But after Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese Air Force, popular opinion shifted in favor of entering the war. That's an explanation that operates at the second level of analysis. Here's another sentence that operates at the second level of analysis. Israel rejected a ceasefire in Gaza because the governing coalition includes right-wing politicians who threaten to bring down the Israeli government if the war ends without the total eradication of Hamas. So this is a statement in the form of a dependent and an independent variable. And you can see there on the screen, I've written which are the independent and dependent variables. And it attributes war, this sentence, this theory attributes war to politics at the national level, inside the state, at the second level of analysis. So we're attributing things that Israel is doing to the politics of the Knesset. The current government of Israel is a coalition of right-wing parties with the power to bring down the government if they don't get their preferred outcome. And that's why Israel refused to enter into a ceasefire agreement for so long. There are also well-known theories that are operating at the second level of analysis. One of them is called the democratic peace theory. And this is a second level theory about why certain countries tend not to go to war against each other. So one of the findings of political scientists is that democracies rarely go to war against each other. This is just an empirical reality. It's simply true. Democracies generally don't go to war against each other. So what are our theories about why this is the case? The theories about why this is the case always operate at the second level of analysis. They're theories about the domestic politics of these countries. So one theory, for example, is that in that a political leader's main goal is to remain in office. So a political leader might decide to go to war in order to boost, or if they think that it's going to boost, their domestic political support. But that only works if they win the war. So if democratically elected leaders go to war and then they lose that war, they tend to lose office. So if they enter a war, if a democratically elected leader is going to enter a war, they're going to pour a lot of resources into it. They're only ever going to enter a war if they believe that they can win. And so if both countries are democracies, they're both making that calculation, and both of them will avoid the war because they know that the other one also is facing the same logic of power that they are. So they know that both of them are only going to enter to win, and so they avert war in that way. It's just one theory about why democracies go to war. But it's a theory that's relevant because it illustrates the second level of analysis. It's happening at that second level. There's another theory about the democratic peace, which argues essentially that it's not democracy that prevents war, that it's actually capitalism, that democracies tend to trade with one another, and countries that trade with one another won't go to war because those trade relationships will be disrupted. It's too expensive. And so for trading partners, the cost of going to war is too high. So that's just another theory of war that operates at the second level of analysis. And then there is a third level of analysis, which is called the systemic level or the international level of relations among states. Realist theories of power, this is where realist theories of power and war operate at this third level of analysis. And so this argument is that the study of the causes of war in political science has traditionally been dominated by realist theories, which are a family of theories that assume that sovereign states or other territorially defined groups act rationally to advance their security, power, and wealth in an anarchic international system defined by the absence of a legitimate authority to regulate disputes and enforce agreements. So that's a quote from Levy on page 16 of your reading for today. So what we want to do now is unpack that a little bit. An anarchic international system is the context in which states operate. So this means simply that there is no international or world government. There are rules, but the states, countries themselves, have made up those rules, and there is no power to enforce them. So governments themselves make decisions about whether or not they're going to follow the rules or not. So an anarchic state system is a world in which there is no world government and nobody but themselves to enforce the rules. In a context like that, countries act rationally to advance their security, power, and wealth, right? So you notice here that this is all about the world system. The focus of countries isn't on their domestic internal politics. It's not on the behavior or the beliefs of a single individual leader like Hitler or Putin or Trump. Instead, it's about the international system and the fact that it's anarchic. And so countries are basically jockeying for position in that context in order to maximize their security, power, and wealth. So realists argue that the primary determinant of international outcomes is the distribution of power at that systemic level. So they're going to argue, realists are always going to argue that it's that the real action is happening at the third level of analysis. So realists will argue, for example, that uh, so realists distinguish between dyadic and systemic levels. And by dyadic, they mean between two potential adversaries. So uh, the both of these are operating at the third level of analysis. So dyadic is between two countries, systemic is among more than two countries, but they're both at the systemic level, right? It's at the level of between or among countries rather than within countries. So, for example, Cambodia and Thailand are a dyad engaged in a border dispute. Two countries basically locked in an interaction that is in their case a border dispute. So realists would argue that whether Cambodia and Thailand will go to war depends on the balance of power between them. If one side is weak and the other is strong, and there is conflict over a border, the stronger country is likely to go to war because they calculate that they will win. So that's a simple equation at the dyadic level between the two countries. But then let's complicate things a bit. The conflict between Thailand and Cambodia is not only dyadic, other parties are involved. So let's say Cambodia has an ally who is likely to come to their assistance. Then Thailand needs to take into account not only Cambodia's relative military weakness, but the likelihood that an ally would join Cambodia against Thailand, and then that neutralizes Thailand's advantage, and it might even make the other side stronger. So that's not actually what happened in this case. There was not an ally that joined Cambodia, but still a systemic reaction was generated by initial clashes between the two countries. So both of these countries, Thailand and Cambodia, are both members of ASEAN. And ASEAN, whose goals are to promote economic growth, peace, and security in the region, in Southeast Asia, has an interest, the organization, the group of nations has an interest in de escalating conflict between these two countries. So Malaysia was the chair of ASEAN at the time of an escalation of cross-border fighting between these two countries. Malaysia is the chair of ASEAN and almost immediately stepped in to broker a ceasefire between Thailand and Cambodia. So now Malaysia is bringing the diplomatic, economic, and military pressure of ASEAN to bear on the parties to the conflict. They're turning what looked like a dyadic conflict between two countries into a systemic conflict in order to try to neutralize it. For Thailand, which is stronger and larger militarily than Cambodia and might be able to win a border conflict against Cambodia quite easily, the calculus has now changed and the stakes are higher. If Thailand persists, it will face opposition and pressure from ASEAN. And as it happens, the US and China, which are not members of this regional organization, but they also got involved to try and broker a ceasefire. So Thailand now faces pressure not only from its regional diplomatic and trading partners, but also from the two largest economic powers in the world. But the point here is that all of this, all of the action is taking place at the third level of analysis, at the systemic level. It's not individual personality, it's not domestic national politics. that determines whether a war happens or not. It's the interaction between the states and among a larger number of states that makes war more or less likely. So the most famous, there's an article in on Quarkus in your module on the conflict between Thailand and Cambodia that's useful to read to think about this. The most famous systemic level theory of war, however, is balance of power theory. And this is a theory that predicts high concentrations of power in the international system generate counterbalancing coalitions so that hegemonies never arise. So a hegemony is a single dominant power. The idea here is that if you have a single dominant power in the world system, a power that would be large enough to do whatever it wanted to, that power imbalance is not going to last for long because other countries will band together to build an alliance that balances out or counterbalances that initial power. So what balance of power theory does is it actually predicts peace. It's an explanation of why countries do not go to war. So the classic example here is the United States and the USSR between 1950 and 1990. The entire balance of power in the world system was dominated by these two superpowers that expended all of their foreign policy energy securing allies to make sure that they retained relative power parity, power equality, that they were roughly equal with one another. And the whole world was essentially divided between allies of the Soviet Union and allies of the United States. And analysts argued at that time that the reason that the world had not entered into another major global war, like World War I and World War II, the reason that World War III didn't happen was that there was a balance of power in the world. The two superpowers knew that if they went to war against one another, they would both be annihilated, and so war was averted. But in 1989, the Soviet Union collapsed. And when that happened, that world system that was sustained by a balance of power also collapsed. So since 1990, we have had a single world hegemon, which is the United States. And there has not been a coalition of countries that has rushed in to create a military alliance that would counter the military power of the United States, that would balance out that power. So balance of power theory worked well to explain the world system for the second half of the 20th century, but it does much worse in explaining the current world system. Another global systems theory that might do a better job today, but also operating, as you can see from the slide, at the third level of analysis, is what's called power transition theory. So this theory predicts that a world system can be stable if there is a single hegemon, a single big power. So everything can be stable so long as there's a single big power and as long as that country's power is stable. But power transition theory predicts that war grows more likely when things start to shift, when that big power starts to decline and another power is rising to take their place. So a major world war could happen as the declining power lashes out to try to maintain its position, or as the ascending power, the one that's getting stronger, tries to take out the superpower in order to establish its hegemony. So, power transition theory might do a better job of describing the world we are living in today than balance of power theory. So, many people have been arguing for the last at least 5 or 10 years that the US is in decline as the world superpower. Its political and cultural influence are dwindling. Its economic power is diminishing as it withdraws from global trade. It's less willing to use its military power to affect outcomes. It's totally lost its moral authority. If all of this is true and the US continues to head in this direction, then power transition theory would predict that conditions are ripe for a major world war as we transition away from the period of US superpower hegemony that's been in place since about 1940. And I think that most people would argue that the rising hegemon is China. So, power transition theory would predict a major world war for global superiority between China and the United States. I'm not saying that that's what's actually going to happen. I have no idea. But I'm saying that that's what power transition theory would predict, that in this period of instability where one power is declining and another is rising, that's when you have a moment that's ripe for a major world war. All right. So now we're going to pivot from world system theories that essentially predict what a set of marbles will do when other marbles move to what are called dyadic theories or models of war. And these are also appropriate to our current situation, to the conflict situations that we see playing out in the world right now. And one way of thinking about this is that our theories of war need to take into account a world in which wars are regional and are most often between two neighboring countries, between India and Pakistan, between Pakistan and Afghanistan, between Thailand and Cambodia, Russia and Ukraine, Armenia and Azerbaijan, Israel and Palestine, China and Taiwan. So, dyadic theories of war are most useful for predicting those kinds of wars that we have today, where most wars are between countries that are next to each other, all of the examples that I offered above, and where the conflicts are very often over territory. So, the first thing that people think about dyadic wars is the first argument people make is that our theories need to explain why the alternative didn't happen. Our theories need to explain why these two countries didn't bargain, why bargaining failed. And the reason is that bargaining and negotiations are always better. They make more sense. Two countries that are next to each other often have conflicts. Usually the conflict is over territory. But it makes more sense for them to negotiate their differences because war is expensive. It kills people, it destroys land, or it makes it unusable, and it costs millions of dollars in weapons, millions of dollars that could be invested in education or disease eradication or building infrastructure. So theorists argue that any theory of war needs to be able to explain the breakdown of bargaining, needs to explain why the better option, the one that's in everyone's best interest, didn't happen. And here, political science has three theories of why bargaining breaks down in dyadic relationships. The first theory is that each side may have private information that the other side doesn't have. And they might have reasons to misrepresent that information. So let's cast our minds back to February of 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia had some private information that the rest of the world did not have. And that was that Putin had secured a promise from China to support the invasion. On the other side, the West also had private information, and that was that the United States and Western Europe would play a very significant role in supporting Ukraine. So this is the idea here is that if Putin had had the information that the West was going to really come in to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia, that Putin might have made different calculations, and that the West might have made different calculations if they had known that China was going to support Putin and stay out of the war and remain neutral in that context. Russia also, for example, thought that Zelensky was going to flee the country and that the whole war would be over in a matter of months. They didn't have the information that Zelensky would stay and that he would rally Ukrainians to fight against Russia and that the war would be ongoing for years. So the idea here is that if everyone had perfect information, they would know in advance what the outcome of the war would be, and they could avoid it by negotiating a settlement. The second reason that theorists argue that bargaining breaks down is called commitment problems. So these arise when the relative power of both sides or one side is in flux. So the side that believes that it's getting weaker wants to go to war now, or maybe they want to settle the war now instead of later when they're weaker and the other side is stronger. So one side has an incentive to do X at exactly the moment when the other side does not have that incentive. And as they get stronger and weaker, each of their calculus changes, and it never changes such that they're both in the same place at the same time. Okay, so that's the argument about commitment problems, is that as one is getting stronger, it has less incentive to negotiate. As one is getting weaker, it has more, and vice versa. So they never meet in a good place. And the third reason is indivisible issues. And these are things that are zero sum that can't be divided. So this is another case when bargaining breaks down. And the argument here is that it's easier to avoid war when the thing that you're fighting over is divisible, when the thing you're fighting over can be divided. So oftentimes territory can be divided. I'll give you Crimea if I can keep the Donbass, for example. I don't know that that's going to happen, but that would be a division of territory. You take this, I'll take this, and let's call it a day. Money can be divided. Sometimes political power can be divided. But then let's say that two countries are fighting over a religious space. Pakistan says a building is an Islamic mosque, but India insists it's a Hindu temple. Very often a thing like that is indivisible. It can only be one thing or the other, and therefore it cannot be negotiated. So that's what theorists mean by indivisible issues or indivisible cause. The cause of the fighting is indivisible. So far, we have focused on theories of war between countries. Why do states go to war against one another? And what are our theories of peace, when we can avoid war, or how to avoid war? But if you look back at the graph, the first thing that I pointed out was that wars between states are not all that common. So they're important to theorize because they kill so many people. The scale of destruction and death is enormous. And so we have strong incentives to understand what causes war and what makes them persist and how we can end them. But in the 21st century, we have a lot more conflicts within states than conflicts between states. So when we're theorizing conflict, we also need to theorize civil war, not just war between countries. So I'm going to start with a background condition that we should think of as pre-existing other theories of civil war. So one of the most basic definitions of political science is the definition of the state. A state is a set of institutions or a structure that holds a monopoly on violence. And this means two things. One is that the state should, as a matter of fact, have a monopoly on violence. The state should be strong enough to prevent other competing sources of violence from arising. And the second thing that it means is that only the violence of the state is legitimate. A state is tasked with protection and enforcement, and if necessary, they can use armies and police forces and weapons and force to carry out the tasks of protection and enforcement. So the background condition of civil war has to do with the power of the state. In order for a civil war to be possible, the state must have lost its monopoly on violence. Civil wars overwhelmingly happen in weak states, in parts of the world where, for many possible reasons, states have failed to prevent the rise of alternative sources of violence. So what are the reasons that states lose their monopoly on violence? Under what circumstances does this background condition come into effect? Most often, that reason is poverty. There are a lot of countries in the world that just don't have the resources to sustain a monopoly on violence. Their militaries are understaffed and not well trained. Everyone is underpaid. They don't have enough weapons, and so on and so forth. And then a common byproduct of poverty is corruption. When the military and the police aren't getting paid enough, they start to take bribes. And so then instead of obeying the laws, regular citizens, as well as criminal gangs and drug cartels, can pay the police to look the other way. So a second reason that a state might lose its monopoly on violence is because the state actors are not doing their jobs. And then a third reason, and this is also a super common reason, is involvement of other more powerful countries. So a state might lose a monopoly on violence because other countries are getting involved in their internal political situation. Another country might be funneling weapons to internal opposition that they believe would be friendlier to their interests. Another country might be trying to create a civil war in your country. So that's a third reason that you might lose your monopoly on violence. But the point is that the absolutely essential background condition of civil war, like by definition, a civil war is a situation in which the state has lost its monopoly on violence. And this happens generally in states that are weak. And that's why maps of civil war show or reveal substantial regional differences in the existence of intrastate violence. That's why, if you look at a map of where the civil wars are happening in the world, they're overwhelmingly happening in poor countries. Are there exceptions? Yes, there are. So, Canada during the 1970s, when the Quebec separatist movement was at its height, it was engaging in violence against the Canadian government, against Canadian citizens, as a way of achieving its goals. Now, that could have become a civil war, but that doesn't mean that it happened because the Canadian government was weak. The civil war between Britain and Northern Ireland lasted for many years, but the British government was very powerful. Britain and Canada were not weak states, but they had, to different degrees, lost their monopoly on violence. So, against that backdrop, theories of civil war are categorized, broadly categorized, into three types of explanations. And those are basically greed, grievance, and opportunity. Those are the most important ones. There are others. So grievance-based theories suggest that civil wars stem from underlying issues of injustice. Things like repression, discrimination, poverty, inequality. And the idea here is that these factors create discontent among usually a segment of the population, and that can lead to collective action and rebellion. So, a classic example of a grievance based civil war would be the Rwandan genocide, when the majority Hutu population, which had experienced decades of repression, exclusion, and economic inequality, rose up against the ruling Tutsi. The Syrian civil war is also an example of a grievance based conflict, which started as a popular uprising against the Ba'athist government of Bashar al Assad. Then there are greed based theories, and this is the theory that civil wars are driven by economic incentives, or some civil wars are driven by economic incentives, that individuals and groups are fighting to gain control of resources and to maximize their profits. So, this is a type of civil war that happens often in countries that have valuable natural resources like diamonds or gold. So the civil war in Angola that lasted for almost 20 years was partly about control over diamond mines. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is a very large country in the middle of Africa that's very rich in natural resources. And they've essentially been in civil war, sometimes more than one civil war, going back at least 70 years. And those wars are almost always for control over resources like gold and tantalum and tungsten and cobalt and copper. And then there are some civil wars. A third very common example or a very common theory of the cause of civil war is opportunity based. So these are a set of theories that focus on the conditions that make it easier for rebellions to start or to sustain themselves. So, state weakness, for example, would be an opportunity. Political instability is an opportunity. An unpopular political leader is an opportunity. But even things like topography and geography can be opportunities, like rough terrain or mountains with good places to hide. So if you read about the Cuban Revolution with Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, they had a small ragtag group of rebels that didn't have much experience or many weapons. And if you read about the Cuban Revolution, one of the things that people really focus on in accounting for their victory is the Sierra Maestra mountain range, which they used as a base. So Guevara and Castro and their group of rebels were hiding in the mountains, and they used the Sierra Maestra mountain range as a place from which to launch their attacks, a place to hide. So they're also fighting a very unpopular dictator. That was also an opportunity. It was also a source of grievance. So, there are a few different things going on here. But one of the things that I always found super interesting is how much that's a story about literally the geography of Cuba is something that is an opportunity that allows this rebellion to succeed. So there are these other causes of civil war, many of which are I'm not going to focus on, but you can read about them and get caught up. What I'm going to run us through finally, what I'm going to conclude with is what's possibly one of political science's most important contributions to the study of war, and that is just war theory. And the idea here is that there should be a standard of justice for war. Now, of course, some people believe that no war is just, but just war theory sets aside that position and makes the case that in a world where war is endemic, where it's common, our work is to decide among them, to come up with a moral framework that can help us to decide when it is just to decide to go to war, what are just ways of behaving in war, and then what outcomes are just. So those are the three component parts of just war theory. There are three distinct moments that need to be subjected to moral scrutiny. So the first is jus ad bellum, which is the right to go to war. Those are the conditions under which a war is justified. And there are a number of reasons, things that you basically have to consider when you're making a decision about whether a war is justified or not. One is, does it have a just cause? Is the war fought for a morally justifiable reason, something like self-defense or to protect others from aggression? The second is right intention. So the motivation for war must be to achieve a just outcome. It can't be for revenge. Otherwise, that's an unjust war. Is it decided by a recognized or legitimate authority, like a government? Is it a legitimate authority that's going to war? Is the war something that's being done only as a last resort? Have all other options been exhausted? Has everything else been tried before we decided to go to war? Proportionality is another key component of a right to go to war. The potential benefits of war must outweigh the potential harm. And finally, there has to be a reasonable chance of success. It has to be at least potentially possible to achieve the goals of the war. We have to know what the goals of the war are. They need to have been clearly articulated, and we have to know what counts as success, and that success needs to be achievable. And then there's right conduct in war. And this aspect deals with the ethical conduct of war. And the key principles include discrimination. That means that attacks should target military objectives and avoid harming civilians or non-combatants. So there has to be a lot of discrimination in the context of war, in the case that you can only attack certain targets. You can't just, carpet bomb the whole population. The second component or feature of the ethical conduct of war is, again, proportionality. The force that is used should be proportionate to the military objective. You only use as much force as you need to in order to get the outcome you want, and you have to avoid any excessive destruction or suffering. So, no harming civilians, and you must avoid excessive destruction or suffering. The third, related again, is called no evil means. And that means that there are certain weapons or tactics, like those that cause unnecessary suffering or indiscriminate harm, that are flat out prohibited. And finally, the treatment of prisoners. Prisoners of war should be treated humanely and not subjected to torture or other forms of abuse. And finally, there's a component of just war theory that focuses attention on justice after the war. What are the moral considerations for ending a war? The first is the restoration of peace. Ending a war in a way that can establish a lasting peace and won't just lead to ongoing conflict. So you need the two sides, or the side that wins, has to construct a peace that is going to last. They can't impose a peace that is just going to lead to more war in the future. The second dimension of it is reconstruction and justice. A just end to the war, a just conclusion of the war, has to include ensuring that the affected areas are rebuilt and that justice is pursued for war crimes. And then the third component, remember, the third component is proportionality and restraint. So one of the things that's interesting is this idea of proportionality goes through all three of the dimensions of just war theory. And at the point of that the